And welcome to the Tech and Test podcast with me, Peter Johnson. And today we've got Michael Mroczka on the show. Hi, Michael.
Hey, Peter. Appreciate you having me on.
So, Michael, do you want to introduce yourself to the Tech and Test audience? Maybe talk about how you got into coding?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I suppose it's helpful to know that I'm a software engineer. I've been kind of a senior software engineer I've been in the industry for about a decade at places like Salesforce and Google. And I got started in coding. This is kind of an embarrassing story, and it's fun to share. But I got started by I used to think physical therapy was the right thing for me, and I actually went 3.5 years into a 4-year degree into physical therapy, and then I got to the end of it, and I realized that wasn't what I wanted to do. And it just so happened that it aligned perfectly with the Marvel movies that came out. And I saw Iron Man making like Jarvis and all the cool stuff. And I'm like, that's what I want to do. And so, yeah, it was actually Marvel Comics and Iron Man. I was like, I'm going to work with AI and I'm going to, kind of build the next Jarvis and stuff like that. And then now we're in this day and age where, Jarvis-like things actually do exist and very realistic conversations with robots are a thing. But yeah, very, very interesting kind of journey to get from physical therapy all the way into now coding.
Wow. Do you still do any physical therapy?
I do some amount. Like I've always kind of been into like fitness and stuff like that. And, I always get, my mom or dad or uncle is like, I've got a shoulder thing. And it's like, so like, okay, we'll go through some stuff. But yeah, I think more people ask me to fix their printer nowadays because they assume, software engineers must know how to fix printers. So
Awesome. And just so the Tech and Test audience know, right, this is a cracking book. Excuse the pun. It's beyond. You're one of the authors on this book, right? And it's an awesome book. I mean, we'll talk about it, but like essentially, Cracking the Coding Interview was like a classic book, which is behind me there. But there's beyond the cracking, the coding interview, and there we're talking a lot more about how things have evolved with the tech hiring process, and AI is here, like you just mentioned, and so I guess. There's a lot of advice in this book, and I encourage everyone to pick up the book and read it themselves. But essentially, like if we're going to talk about tech interviews and the use of AI, because I've conducted loads of tech interviews over my career, and something that's become more of a concern is the person on the other side of the call. Usually the interviews I've done have been a mixture of in-person and virtual interviews. But the virtual ones, I can't always see what they're doing, right, with their keyboard and what screens they're looking at. So how do I know if someone's ChatGPTing my solution, right? So I guess this is some of the challenges we have with coding interviews. And when we talk about coding interviews, the interviews I typically have seen are very sort of leet style coding. Mm-hmm. So what's been your experience with coding interviews in the sort of realm of AI, and how has that changed from maybe like 5 to 10 years ago?
Yeah, this is my niche to talk about right here. This is so great. So I love doing interviewing, and I do interviewing for fun. Basically, once a quarter, I make sure I'm interviewing someplace. And I think at this point, the amount of interviews I do have changed dramatically. And there's a lot of things that have changed in the last sort of decade. Some of that was from the pandemic, and some of that is just based on the fact that interviews are now mostly remote, which, like you said, makes it a lot harder to cheat. What I would say is that there's two kind of parts of the sort of things I do. The first one is sort of helping interviewees get better at passing those interviews. But the other thing I do is I actually consult for companies sort of cheating and sort of how to prevent cheating and stuff like that. It's a very niche thing within the interview process that a lot of companies are getting increasingly worried about. But it's kind of like, I like to, if you ever seen one of those action movies where you've got the bank robber that's like actively robbing a bank, and then it turns out they were actually a consultant hired by the bank to like do the robbing. I kind of do that as well. So people hire me to like see, can I cheat through the interview process, and record myself doing that. And we talk about the virtual interviews being like, are they using, ChatGPT clandestinely on another monitor or something like that? But just to be clear, cheating happens even in in-person interviews and stuff as well. We've seen instances of people bringing in microphones, like little things, like little headsets and stuff like that to try and pass those traditional whiteboard interviews that are becoming more common. So Yeah, I'm not sure if that directly answers your question, but like it shows the extent of this problem, which is it's a lot more easy to cheat now with AI than ever before.
Wow, I never thought someone would put an earpiece in to cheat.
It's like a whole thing now. It's like it's getting worse. It really is.
Wow, you almost need to go through like some security screening before you enter the room.
Absolutely, absolutely. Have you ever had anyone that you've thought in an interview blatantly be cheating before? Has it ever been like very, very
Hmm.
obvious to you that somebody is clearly using AI in some way on the other end?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like, you can never be 100% sure, right? There's not like, of course I'm cheating, right?
Right,
But
right.
but some of these tools, like, think like HackerRank, they do give you like suspicious activities. So, um, if you're seeing the user potentially like resize a screen or open a new tab, or suddenly there's no activity within the session for and they're supposed to be typing code during that period, you kind of think, what else are they doing
Yeah.
during that time? So, and you can
Mhm.
look at things like eye movement as well, like and I don't think there's any like 100% clear cut, but I've had a few interviews where I've gone, you were struggling with this problem, you didn't quite explain how you're going to solve this problem. Suddenly, you have the full solution.
Yep.
So
It's like those don't add up.
it doesn't add up, right? I want to hear. So I think if someone's thinking in the right direction and there's strong signals of like, I know how to solve this problem, if they don't quite get the syntax, you can kind of feel them on the right track, right? But sometimes I've been like interviewing someone, and it's been very clear that they haven't quite solved the problem in their head, and miraculously, like, there's some code that appears, and that's when it does a raise suspicion on, is AI being used here somehow? Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the kind of back and forths that we had when writing the book was sort of like, what are the steps of the interview process? And there's like a whole chapter that's dedicated to like the anatomy of a coding interview, basically. And one of the steps in it that I find a lot of people are resistant to, that's actually very helpful, is sort of like, let's just say, okay, let's forget about data structures and algorithms. If I just didn't care at all and had infinite time and like infinite CPU, how would I solve the problem? And
Right.
like just kind of get like a brute force, naive solution to the problem. And I think that's also such a deterrent from an AI standpoint. Like if somebody's like thinking through like what is the
Mm,
way to do the problem, like it's
mm.
clear that they didn't just immediately chat GPT the thing. So
Yeah.
like being able to walk through a way to do the problem is I think underrated. A lot of people like it's a waste of time, but I still think it's a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. Let's like solve a two sum or three sum, like,
Exactly.
using nested for loops without using a hash
Exactly.
map, for example, right? So,
Exactly.
yeah, I think that's a good. Never thought about that, but that's a good stepping stone within a coding interview, right? It's like, let's not worry about performance. How would you just brute force this? Okay, now you've solved that. What data structure could we add in here to improve the time complexity, for example, right? So,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, that's a
There's
good point.
And there's a bunch of common ways to sort of improve those things over time. I'm not suggesting that you fully code the entire, brute
Sure.
force thing. Like, of course, we don't want to waste time in the interview, but
Yeah.
like you can sketch like what the skeleton of that code would look like in
Yeah.
3 minutes. It's like three, like you said, threesome. It's like three for loops. It's like a very,
Yeah.
and then a conditional statement. It's very easy. So it's worth that like couple of seconds of thought, I think, to then get you kind of going in the right direction.
Absolutely. And it also gives a strong signal to the interviewer that you understand how to solve the problem, but not necessarily in the most efficient way. But if you're able to then switch up gears and go, actually, we could try to, what I'm trying to do now is improve efficiency and performance. And at least there's a story to be had there, right? It's not just, oh, here's the most efficient solution off the shelf that I'm
Absolutely.
presenting.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think people go a little too far with like their first thought is always like, how do I solve it optimally? And that's kind
Right.
of like the wrong first thought to have. What I find is like one of the most common things we see over and over again in interviews, and I've done thousands of them at this point, is that literally people like don't read the question. So like
Yeah.
one of the things that I tell people again is like, don't just read it once, read it twice. Really make sure you understand
Yes.
it. If they give you a bunch of examples, make sure you understand those examples. There might be a bomb in the like fifth example of like, oh, that's a good edge case. I'm glad that they gave me that as an example. And that's very common, especially at like places like Google and Meta. They'll give you a few cases. And it's like if you only do the first one, and then you're like, okay, I understand the problem. It's like you're missing
Yeah.
out on the information you're being given. So people, I think, just struggle with even just understanding the problem, and you can't solve a problem that you don't understand.
Yes, 100%. I think for me, what's a red flag when someone starts coding up an interview without really reading the full question properly, like,
No.
and or even digesting and processing the information. I would rather see the candidate go, "I need a few minutes here," right?
Yes.
Um, hmm.
Yes.
And then, I think sometimes there's a pressure that you need to continuously be communicating within the interview, and
Absolutely.
sometimes it's okay, I think, this is me, my personal opinion, to go, I need a few minutes just to read a question, understand what test cases I need to write, and just set yourself up for thinking a bit. Yeah. So a red flag for me is always just quickly going and diving straight in and going, then what was the question again?
Absolutely. And that's so common. Like, I think everybody hears don't jump in too soon, and then everybody does anyways. It's really sad, but I do think that the the whole idea of speaking out loud is also another, like, just common myth. It's like, especially you hear in the Google interview that you need to be out, like, talking out loud, and they care about speaking out loud. Really, the entire purpose of that is just you need to explain to the interviewer what you're thinking. If they understand where you're
Yes.
going and they're not lost, and you're not spending 2-3 minutes at a time silent, like, it's just not that big a deal. Like, you don't take a huge hit you don't take any hit if you take a 30-second, like, break. And if you communicate to the interviewer, hey, I need a minute, then you can have even more time. So it's like, but that's like totally a side tangent. I think the worst kind of folks that I've ever seen do this is they'll be in the interview and they feel the need to talk, but they don't have anything to talk about. So they will
Right.
narrate their code. For
Yes.
int I equals 0, I less than, and it's like, look, I can see what you're doing. Why are we narrating the code itself? That's those egregious offenders, I think, of that.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. And actually, the code is readable enough, hopefully, that you don't need to narrate what's on the screen.
Exactly.
And, actually, I think it's useful if you go, I'm using this data structure. If you want to really show like time and space complexity, to go explain maybe why you're using the data structure, because then that's a strong signal that you understand. I'm using a hash map here because of O1 in theory complexity for accessing the keys, right? It's like poof, straight there,
Yes.
right? Or this search is going to take me n log n because I'm going to be using the quicksort algorithm,
Yeah.
or timsort, which whatever. But I
Yeah.
think explaining little hints. I don't know. This is my feeling is you're giving the interviewer a strong signal that you understand the data structure, right? Especially in a data structures algorithms interview. If it's like a code quality or like correctness interview, you may not want to hammer down too much on the data structures, right? And just go, is this code actually readable and nicely laid out? So
I totally agree with you. And I think that you just talked about red flags. I'd consider those green flags. This is
yes,
all interviews are about showing signal, both positive and sometimes, unfortunately, negative signal to your interviewer. And I
unfortunately,
think
yeah,
that yeah, one of those positive things is, like you said, just those side tangent comments, and they should just be comments. They shouldn't be,
yes,
you shouldn't, you say that's like, oh, it's O1 time for a hash map lookup. Like, that's fine. It's a brief. It's one statement. You shouldn't go into, like, well, because dynamic arrays are based on, like,
yeah.
you shouldn't dive into it, of course. But these little handholds for an interviewer to grab on and ask you questions about are helpful, and it just sort of shows seniority. And then, depending on how you even phrase those things, it can be show more seniority or less seniority. So,
Yes.
just as an example, like, if you say it's O1 lookups, that's different than saying it's amortized O1 lookups. You know what I mean?
Right.
It shows, like, deeper levels of kind of going down it. And it's not that you have to phrase everything exactly just right, but the more that you can sort of show that you have knowledge in that area, the better off you're going to be.
Yes, 100%. And especially for the level of the role you're applying for, right? So if it's really tuned with like the level above or the same level, it gives you that extra like seniority, I guess, for that role. So you're matching signals above the level that you applied for, which
Absolutely. And though I'd be curious, on your end, do you find that you grade people differently, like, dramatic? Like, do you ask different questions to seniors than you would juniors, or do you find that
hmm.
you end up just kind of keeping the same questions but expect that they sort of go faster? Every company approaches this differently, so I'm always curious to see what people do.
Yeah, it's a good question. Like I think sometimes it's left on the individual engineer who's interviewing to make that decision, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
there's not a strict process sometimes, and it also depends what part of the life cycle maybe you're in within the interviewing, right? So if you're doing a technical screen, chances are that question may be similar to a senior engineer to a junior engineer, but it's how you solve that problem. And, do you get to the efficient solution? How did you get to the efficient solution? Did you get to the space where you could talk about time and space complexity? Sometimes, and did you do that within, it could even be, did you solve this in 10 minutes, right? Maybe for a junior, you could take half an hour to solve it or 20 minutes to solve it, because we're not expecting a quick, and actually, if the first question went well, another one may come in, right? So it's all to do with, I think it's always fluid and based on the candidate's profile. If I feel like I'm interviewing a senior engineer that's worked, in the industry for 10, 15 years, maybe 20 years, and they've got a lot of experience and they put their expertise in language X, I really want to check that they know language X idiomatically.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's kind of part of what I'm trying to de-risk. Is that actually a fair assessment, right, of what's on the CV?
Absolutely. And I think that's the right way to go about it. Sometimes, like, when it comes down to the individual level, like you mentioned speed, and speed is the thing I have the hardest time on. I think if you were to go and look on, let's say, any of those anonymous platforms that just sort of like where the worst of humanity sort of comes out, where they sort of like, kind of talk about all the negatives of the interview process, you'll find some people that say things like, "Oh, I was expected to do 2 lead code hard questions in 20 minutes." And I think that's usually not the case. In my experience, I found that on average, most companies are asking medium level questions. But how we define sort of mediums, it kind of, there are some easy mediums and some hard mediums for sure. So there's some variability there. But I think the focus on speed is almost crazy. I think there are very few questions that are good questions that also can be answered in 10 minutes. Like if somebody's answering a lead code medium in 10 minutes, they are either like are very, very good, or more likely like the questions leaked, like they knew it ahead of time or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, 10 minutes was maybe not a good example of time, but if someone's taking the full block of time to solve what should be an icebreaker question,
yes,
there's something wrong there, right?
Oh, that I 100% agree with. Oh, and I guess that's actually a good side point. It's like, is this an icebreaker question?
Right.
Yeah, 10 minutes is, like you said, totally reasonable. Or like, was there an intent for a second one? So Meta is well known for asking 2 questions in their interview loop. Google less so. They do so sometimes. And then Amazon's all over the place as to, depending on the team that you interview for, whether you're going to get 1 question or 2. So even knowing that ahead of time is really important. I think you see people that are like, I solved all the questions optimally and I didn't get a solution. It's like, well, did you solve the icebreakers optimally? Was there another question you didn't even get to? So it's like, it's always hard to know when people say that,
Yeah, it's really hard. And I think that's the thing you don't always get to know, right? 100%. Like, I don't even think recruiters will tell you that level of information for an interview. Like, it could just be the engineer that interviews you on what they think they want to ask you, right? But yeah, when I was mentioning the 10 minutes, it's more of an icebreaker. It's case of let's get you geared up for the main show.
100%.
So yeah, if you're stuck on the icebreaker and we're 45 minutes into the interview, then it's kind of like, right, okay, that's fine. It's just we didn't get a chance to actually do the main question. And I guess we're talking about different seniorities of role. Like, if I was a new grad that just graduated from college now in computer science, and I was looking to apply for one of the big tech companies, in your experience, what do you think I should start doing off the bat?
Yeah, that's a great question. So assuming a new grad has sort of just graduated, there's a couple of things I hope they already have done. One of those things is, at this point, we're seeing that internships matter more than ever. So if you don't have any internships, and you're still in college for any sort of computer science related degree, software engineering, whatever it may be, definitely prioritize that. I would say prioritize that over grades. Honestly, your GPA is looked at once for like 1 year, but like your experience matters a heck of a lot more in this industry. So like, if you have to like take a GPA hit, I'd even say like go ahead and do that, because this is really, really important for actually getting jobs later on. So if you have some amount of internship experience, I find it's a little easier. But the biggest way, and this would be true of junior engineers to intermediate and even senior engineers, is the way you get into a tech company is by knowing somebody that can vouch for you. And that's not a popular thing to hear. People want to think that they can just sort of apply and stand out by the right keywords on their resume or something like that. But quite honestly, there's a post that I can link to, maybe in the show notes we can link to, that's basically like detailing why resumes are and resume reviews specifically are kind of snake oil. It's like there's no special keywords that you can put on your resume that are going to get you through. Like, to a certain extent, resumes at this point are outdated. The most success we see for people getting into tech companies is actually trying to skip the recruiter altogether and finding hiring managers on LinkedIn that are actively hiring. And there's a handful of different kind of cool ways to do this, and there's some tools to make it easier to find these folks. But there are people that are like, a hiring manager at Google will post and say, "Hey, I'm hiring." Now, of course, they're going to get a flood of people from LinkedIn, of direct candidates. But if you can, if you know what their email is, or you have a way of kind of getting their email, sending them a professional email of like, "Hey, here's my CV," then you stand out from other people, and it's a much easier way to get in. Then you have that sort of connection, and then from there you can kind of get through the door. But it's easy to just send this into the black hole or the abyss, and kind of go the wrong way about it. The other thing I'd say, just when it comes to folks that are new grads, is there's definitely this lead code component, and I'd say probably 90% of folks I work with realize lead code and data structures and algorithms. For those that aren't familiar with the website lead code, those questions are crucial to the success. Like, if you are not really decent at medium level questions, there's a very good chance that you do not get an offer. But the other thing people forget about is that there are behavioral components to that, like, as well. So there's multiple facets to the interview, but I'd say, yeah, the lead code is really, really important, especially if you want to get into a FAANG or FAANG adjacent like company.
I say, yeah. I think, is it worth someone getting like Lead Code Premium, or just starting with the Lead Code Basic, like free version? Like, if you're a new grad and you're trying to save some money and maybe not do premium,
Yeah.
I don't know. Is Lead Code free? Is that enough to get people in? Do you think, with
It's
the
a good question.
resources?
I think there are ways to do things for dramatically cheaper than what you can do. And full disclosure here, this runs the gambit of like, these free things online where you don't spend a penny on this, to you can spend literally thousands of dollars a month on coaches that will like walk you through. Like, I'm one of those coaches, quite honestly. Like, I can
Yeah.
walk you through exactly what to do. I wouldn't like, there are way cheaper ways to do this, just to be completely transparent. But I think Lead Code Premium clocks in at somewhere between $100 and $150, I think, a month. So
Right.
it's not a bad use of money. But I would say that, if you got a book or something like that, that's going to have similar types of questions and be similar. And of course, there's my book, but I'm not even just talking about my book. Like, Beyond Cracking the Coding Interview is definitely a good resource, but Elements of Programming Interviews came out, 5 or 6 years ago, and the questions in there are still fantastic as well. So there are other ways to do this on sort of a shoestring budget if you need to. I don't think premium is necessary, but if you've got $100 to throw at it, it's not a bad use of money.
Cool. And so, if we've talked a lot about like pros and the sort of how things can end up in an interview, the kind of mistakes people make, and the sort of good green flags that people should also like reach out and say in comments, and help the interviewer hear the signal, see the signal
Yes.
in the
Yes.
interview. What other things beyond sort of coding interviews should folks be focusing on? Like, I know at Google they have like this googliness round, right?
Yes.
Which
Yes.
I think Amazon have leadership principles integrated into their interviews. So how because I've heard from people who've interviewed candidates at these big tech companies, sometimes if you don't get the story right, it doesn't matter
Yep.
how good your leak coding or your coding problem is, if it's not framed correctly, or you don't come across in the right way, even if you meant good intentions to come across in that particular way, you could still be unsuccessful, right? So how do we sort of level up behavioral interview skills with folks who maybe don't have that work experience, or maybe do have that work experience. Maybe they've been working in the company for 10, 20 years and they don't know how to explain that in an interview. What kind of tips would you give someone?
That's it's a good question, but I want to actually turn it back on you and kind of ask, just because I know we've talked, I think in the pre-show, that you've actually interviewed at lots of different kind of companies, and without kind of getting
Right.
into the exact ones, I know you worked at Google before and stuff like that. What did you find? Were the behaviorals harder than the coding interviews, or did it change based on companies? What was your experience there as far as that goes?
Yeah, good question. So I guess it's really important to um, spend some time on the behaviorals, right? So, from my personal advice would be, don't just focus on the leak code only,
Yes.
and there needs to be a certain format with how explain your stories, right? So, I think the typical format is STAR, right?
Yep.
Specific,
Hmm.
task, action, result. So, I don't want to hear someone talking, or in my case, right, I managed to condense my stories into that format, and also be prepared with loads of stories on your technical experience. Someone could ask you to, go into details of the story quite a lot, so don't make them up. Make sure they're real stories. And
Yes.
I think, because I think it's easy to build up notes on potential stories, but they need to be real. They need to have truth into them, because it comes across if you're not telling the truth. So I think it's a lot easier to talk about something you've worked on. And everyone's got a story to talk about, but I think how we frame those stories, I think what I've learned is quite important. You may want to actually like spend some time with someone and just read them out aloud, and not just in your head as well. I think
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
that's kind of something maybe I've learned, is how to communicate stories concisely and efficiently and get the points across.
I completely agree. I do think that when it comes to the actual behavioral, there's probably less like full prep that you need to do. I would actually say I think definitively there's less prep that you need to do, but it's not nothing. And the problem is people do nothing, and then they end up not doing well in the interviews. And I would say it also varies by level. If you're coming in again at that new grad
Yeah,
persona we're talking about, like of course you don't have great experiences of times you've like had a manager disagreement or something like that. But I do think that the more senior you get, the more important it is, and every company sort of focuses on it in slightly different ways. So at Google, if you're less than senior level, internally, my friends and I used to joke that it's the "Are you a serial killer?" test. And it's like it's really truly, if you answer no, I'm not a serial killer, great, you pass the interview. It's just that easy. Now, of course, the higher levels you go, the more important your answers become. But for the most part, it's a very simple thing. Whereas at Amazon, even like a junior engineer, like they make sure that you have interviews questions structured exactly like you said in that star format, but also for specific questions, stories prepared. It's called leadership
right.
principle interviews. And like if
Okay.
you Google it, you'll find that there's a ton of different information on exactly the types of things they're looking for, the signals they're asking. And yeah, it's very involved. Same thing with Meta. They actually care quite a lot about your behavioral answers, even sort of as junior engineer. So every company is different, and every role is gonna, kind of determine how you answer these questions will determine what level they actually end up placing you at. So it matters a lot.
Yes, I think the key thing is knowing the company you're applying for, right? And understanding what culture they have, what's the hiring process look like, what's important for that company. So if
Yes.
you're applying to one of the big tech companies, just because they're a big tech company, they're not all going to have the same profile and flavor of how they do interviews. So understanding which one you're applying for. And I would even say like reaching out to someone. I don't want to encourage this too much, because I don't know what everyone feels about this, but reaching out to someone maybe works there, and just kind of gauging what the culture is like, because every company's got a different culture. And I
Yes.
think understanding what's important for that company is kind of helpful, right?
Absolutely. And reaching out, like asking questions is like it puts you so far ahead if you just know what to expect. And there are some people
Right.
that go in totally blind and don't know what to expect. And that's obviously gonna hinder performance. What I would say is depending on who you're asking, just kind of be wary of the
Yeah.
question. So a good example of this that I see fairly regularly is people will ask a recruiter at some company. Let's say it's I'm not even going to name a specific company because I don't want to throw any shade
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
particular companies. But I imagine they're interviewing at a company and they ask, should I expect leet code questions? Should I expect system design questions like design Twitter or design Facebook Messenger? And then the recruiter, because you've led, what was it called?
Right.
Leading the question, asking a leading question. It's so easy for the recruiter who is already sort of overworked and underpaid to just sort of say yes. And then you think now, okay, you've asked these questions and you think for sure there's going to be a system design interview and leet code questions. And then you get into the interview and it's nothing like that. And it's like you're designing a tic-tac-toe board or something like that in the interview. So it's really important to just kind of like, take every kind of bit with a grain of salt. I've had lots of people ask if it's going to be a technical interview and be told no. And it's just going to be a non-technical screening.
Right.
And then it turns out actually you're asked a technical question. So it's just like, I'm always like a little hesitant, like just be on guard for the process to still be a little wonky, is what I'd say.
Yeah, really good advice. Yeah. I think, what could seem like a behavior interview with, let's say like a product owner or manager could quickly switch up to being a coding session, right? And I think I've seen that happen before. So it's good to be prepared. I think if I'm going through the interview process, I think I'm going to be on tenterhooks for anything to happen.
Yes, it's a good way to kind of sort of approach it. If you're always on edge a little bit, it's probably in your best interest. When it comes to the folks that you've actually done interviews for, because you've actually been on the interviewer side of this as well. Have you found that there are lots of people that just totally were not prepared for that kind of thing? And like, how often do you think that happens? Or do you find the places that you've done interviews for, they generally knew what to expect and were sort of well prepared?
Yeah. So often in some companies I've worked at, I've had recruiters reach out to me directly and say, the candidate is asking these questions. Are they allowed to use like Google, for example, and my answer is no, typically. And the reason I tend to say no is because I can be that Google for you. If you don't quite understand the library, it's not the end of the world. I can tell you what that particular library is. So, for example, if you don't know the request library on how to access an API, a little bit alarming, but it's not maybe the end of the world. I can tell you what function call you need to call, and we can move on from that bit, right? And it's not necessarily a deal breaker, but it's kind of so there I do get it's quite obvious if someone hasn't prepared for even what could sound like an ice-breaking question within an interview of tell me your experience, and they tend to spend 10, 15 minutes reading out their CV and reading out every single company on the CV, right?
Yes. Every bullet point.
Every bullet point. And it's like, great, I just asked, to introduce yourself, but we've spent 15 minutes now. So sometimes it's knowing how to manage the candidate within the interview to go, okay, that's great. We need to sort of move on, and trying to find a way of doing that in a way that we don't want to sort of brush the candidate off in any sort of negative way, but also we need to get to the coding part of the interview and also leave time for questions at the end.
Yes.
So, I think this is the thing to bear in mind, right? An interview is very timed and prepared, at least by the interviewer. So if the candidate doesn't have the same level, basically what I'm trying to say is interviewers also have to spend time preparing for an interview, right?
Yeah.
They have to write notes during the interview. They have to give feedback to other stakeholders within the business. They often, if it's an in-person interview, there's logistics involved with booking rooms, getting laptops available, and that kind of thing potentially. So there's a lot of preparation that needs to happen. Sometimes looking at the candidate's profile, looking for interview questions to ask. All of this is not zero time. So it's not great if a candidate appears in an interview and there's a strong signal, talking about signals, that they haven't prepared, because it's not the lack of they don't know something, it's the lack of preparation that comes across, right, within an interview. And as an interviewer, it can be frustrating seeing a candidate has not prepared. It's like, I've had to prepare for this. So I think that's something which we don't talk about a lot, but there is some kind of signal that's also communicated there.
Yeah, and it's so interesting being on the interviewer side of things. I think you're exposing a little bit of that other frustration, because I think there's so much information online about like how do we do better in interviews as an interviewee, But like
Yes.
if you just do 1 or 2 interviews, even if it's a mock interview with your friend, all of a sudden you see the world differently. You're like, oh, that's an annoying habit. I hope this person stops doing. It's like, is this person constantly swiveling in their chair while coding? It's like, so there's tons of different things just like that. And yeah, it's definitely when it comes to the actual sort of preparation, a hard thing. One other thing I just want to point out there is you even mentioned at the beginning where people talk about themselves. So we call it Team A. It's tell me about yourself.
Okay.
And being able to quickly and concisely communicate for 1.5 to 2 minutes a little bit about yourself is like such an underrated skill in an interview. There's lots of information that kind of suggests that like interviewers make snap judgments, and those snap judgments can affect, the rest of the 30, 45 minutes that you're going to have time with them. And that first 60 seconds, first 2 minutes really kind of can matter. I don't think that a great introduction is necessarily going to pass you if you bomb the technical portion of the interview, but it certainly is going to color their whole perception of you. And I think if you can concisely say a little bit about yourself, a little bit, throw in, just a little like something that you do personally, something like that in a very brief period of time, you're much better off. So people don't practice that enough, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's something that it sounds so obvious, just tell me about yourself, but it does actually take some practice and preparation, right? Because what signal are you giving to someone? What bits are actually important when you talk about yourself for 10 minutes? Which bits do you talk about for 10 minutes, right? So I think aligning that with the role is also quite important, like not just going down this rabbit hole of topics and themes which are not necessarily important. And also I think reading the interview is also quite important, right? If the interviewer looks quite hurried and they're in back-to-back meetings, maybe going down that rabbit hole
Yeah.
of if the interviewer looks quite relaxed and maybe doesn't necessarily looks like they've got time on their hands, then I think maybe you could open it up an extra 30 seconds or so, give a bit more
Yeah.
context. But if they look really rushed and serious and, I'm trying to keep everything on time here, maybe keeping it a bit more concise is kind of better.
You're so right. And that actually extends even just to the technical portions, because I think reading that interviewer, it's such a hard skill to be able to teach people. But like, if you suggest a exponential algorithm for something and the interviewer's like, giving you signs that like maybe that's not the best approach, like you need to be able to pick up on that. And certainly
Yes.
there are tips and tricks of like ways you can phrase things that don't make it sound like you're asking for a hint. Like there's certainly things you can do to make
Yeah.
this better. But at the end of the day, like read the room, like learn to be able to sort of have that EQ rather than just IQ.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's underrated sometimes, and I've seen that with candidates I've interviewed where potentially they haven't always read the room or the time. Sometimes if you're not quite finishing your solution off, maybe trying to wrap up what you have and get that really working at least is kind of more important than trying to polish all the variable names right at the top of the solution when you haven't got the working solution, right? So.
Absolutely. It sounds a little bit like you know that from experience.
Yeah, it's a frustration from being on the interviewer side, right?
Yes.
And actually, I think I really liked your suggestion of if you've never interviewed someone, I think either find out if you can interview someone
Yeah.
or, maybe get a coach or maybe get a friend. I think that's really useful because I think there's a totally different perspective with when you
Yes.
interview someone and being that interviewer and are very different roles and different emotions and different experiences. And I think it helps maybe being a better interviewer and interviewee doing both.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it comes down at the end of the day to just sort of like understanding what do they want? What are interviewers looking for? And
Yeah.
I think that can broadly be thought of in sort of between 4 and 5 categories when you think of it. Certainly communication is important, problem solving ability, your actual code, like do you write code that makes sense? Like can you write syntactically correct code or at least close to syntactically correct code? Do you know what you're talking about? Can you verify if your solution is correct? To a certain extent, speed matters, but at the end of the day, like knowing what they're looking for and being able to then sort of, like you said, give those little hints at different positive signals, really, really important.
Cool. And from your experience, like, if you're trying to hire the best people in your company, what kind of themes have you seen that like are typically asked in technical interviews in like the big tech companies, for example? Is there anything you see that's repeated across these companies that kind of stands out as, it may not be a particular question, but is there like a general theme to kind of technical interviews that is always clearly there?
Yeah, I think so. There's so much bashing about the interview process. Everybody hates every aspect of the interview process, quite honestly, and I think some of that's very justified. When it comes down to what big tech does, big tech, if you kind of view it from their lens, they interview hundreds of thousands of people. It's amazing the number of people that they interview regularly, how much time, but even just money is spent interviewing people. So to be able to do this at scale, like you can't have a take-home test that you give to people because that's going to be immediately leaked. You can't have some of these other suggestions where people are like, well, give me 5 hours to do the lead code question. It's like, well, even if we practically could somehow do that to you, it's like, it's not fair because now we're not kind of treating people equally with the time perspective. So I would say that right now, these data structure and algorithm questions are best for these big companies because they scale well. It's easy to find new ones. If you find that one of the questions you have leaks, it's easy to ask a question that's slightly different, and it's easy to change the inputs and outputs to be slightly different. So it works well at a big tech scale. And I'd say that the opposite is true at small companies. So I don't know if you've ever interviewed at startups or things like that, but you'll find that some ask data structure and algorithm questions, and others ask more practical questions like design a REST API or something like that, something more focused on the day-to-day things. And I think it's kind of a mistake usually for a startup to ask these scale level kind of questions, because you actually can ask like a very specific Java question or like build a CRUD API or something like that, or like design this web component in React, and you can get a little bit more specific with that kind of thing, and it won't immediately be leaked because you have a fewer number of people going through it. So yeah, I think just kind of realizing as a big tech company, like, are you a big tech company and do you need to do things in a big tech company way, or are you not? So many people are like, well, I'm going to interview like Google because it's Google. And that's I think the totally wrong approach. I think when it comes to interviewing process, like Google's interview process works well for Google, but not necessarily for everyone else.
Yeah, that's a really good piece of advice. Just because a big tech company is doing it doesn't mean to say it fits every single niche company ever, right? On how they should approach it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's good piece of advice. Like, know what company you're trying to work for, and maybe that also helps, right, with your interview preparation. So that's also critical to getting through the hiring process. Awesome. So how do you just thinking about the different roles we have in software engineering, right? So we typically have like the new grad, someone just left college or university, and they're looking for their new first role. And we talked about internships and some preparation on leak code and behavioral interviews to get it into a role and reaching out to someone. There's also mid-level engineers that have been in the industry for some time and they're ramping up their skills, they're getting experience on different projects, and that's all cool. And I guess you've also got these senior engineers, right? Who've been at the company for a very long time and working on maybe larger problems at scale and that kind of problem. How do we differentiate these two kind of roles or these two kind of people within the interview process? Because if you think about all the different tech companies, large, big tech companies, there is a standardized process between each company. Is there a standardized process between a new grad and a senior engineer? And if that process is standardized, then how do we sort of evaluate a like senior system or software engineer versus that new grad?
That's such a great question. It's a good point. I think we've sort of hit consistently on this idea that more than anything else, it matters like what company are you interviewing at, and the different
Yeah.
companies are going to have different processes, even for the same role. So I'd say most companies, for instance, if it's a junior or even intermediate role, aren't going to ask system design, for instance. But system design is a huge part for senior engineers, and that's like totally outside the scope of just like the traditional coding interview and what a junior or intermediate engineer might prepare for. So a good example of this might be Netflix, for instance. So they have a totally wacky, if I can say that, a totally wacky process compared to other FAANG companies. Most places you think might have 2, 3, 4 coding interviews. Not Netflix. They go typically just with 1, maybe 2. And they actually don't weigh them very heavily. If you don't code particularly well, you can still pass those interviews. And they're usually fairly simple questions. We're talking lead code easies, maybe a
Mm,
medium.
mm.
But what they really stress is system design. And Netflix was known for a long time actually of only hiring senior engineers. That's no longer true. They do actually hire junior engineers as well. But even the junior engineers are expected to go through this intense system design process. So when we say that they're like, when they're hiring junior engineers, I've seen a lot of junior engineers with like 6 years of experience be hired.
Yeah.
So it's like, but the process for Netflix is like somewhere between 4 to 6 different system design interviews, which means that's 8
Wow.
interviews in total that you're doing, from end to end of the whole process. And that's very, very different. But the system design interviews are a totally different animal. It's like, it's not even something that we cover in the book because it's like such a big departure
Yes.
from the traditional structure and stuff like that. And there are some other resources which I'm happy to recommend if you'd like, but I do think that the system design interview is a huge piece that can be relevant. And again, Netflix really focuses just on system design, but Google, they're going to care. Meta, they're going to care about system design. But if you don't pass those coding interviews, you're still not going to get through. So it's not a matter of like
Mm.
one or the other. It's usually a matter of both. Netflix is a little bit of the exception in that case.
Wow. So not only have you got to get your behavior interviews solid, I think what I've noticed here is, if you're interviewing at the different big tech companies, they're all going to have a different focus on what's really important. So
Absolutely.
I think Amazon's going to be very focused on their behaviors, but also the coding. So that's going to
Yes.
all be there. Google has its Googliness interviews and behavior, which also has to be there, and the coding and
Yes.
the system design. But I think what I've heard here is like Netflix, there's a really strong focus on system design. So I really think, again, it comes back to the same point, right? Really understanding who you're applying to, and then you can kind of figure out what you want to be preparing on, right? Whether it's like lead coding more, or actually looking at systems and how would you design like the next Facebook or Instagram, right? And what kind of top level components would you need to sort of build up a system, and the difference between the different caching levels, for example, and all of that kind of
Yes.
thing you need to know in system design that becomes quite important in your senior role when you're actually like building a system out rather than just coding a particular feature. So yeah, good point. And I think maybe that's the differentiation between a role maybe that's more junior and more senior, because it's very difficult to really build up that knowledge on system design if you haven't actually built some systems, right? So
If I can say one thing, I do think that is entirely true, that what you say. But what I've found is there are many engineers that work at just smaller companies where maybe they have 10 years of experience, but they've just never needed message queues or
yeah.
Redis or caching. It's just like
Hmm.
they work on a small app and it doesn't matter. So I think there's this sort of perception that if you have X number of years of experience, you necessarily now like have this knowledge, and like
True. Yeah.
many people fall into the category where they don't. And it's less about have you practically implemented all of these things, and it's a lot
Right.
more about, are you familiar with them? Like if you know what the tools are and know when they can be used, even if you haven't used them, that's a perfectly valid sort of thing. And in the interview, the expectation is not, here's Redis and this was the most recent time that I've used it. It's more just like, here's the
Yeah.
technology that we can use
Yeah.
to solve this specific problem.
Yeah. It's kind of understanding the trivia around system design, right? Which
Yes.
I guess there's a lot of resources like which talk about the system design trivia on like
Mm.
so there's a slight difference in terms of understanding the trivia but not actually using it, and then actually like using that and understanding the trivia. And I don't know in a system design interview if how you're describing the system, if it's obvious if someone has actually built a system like that versus someone just knows the technologies to use, the sort of pattern matching on the technologies to use for the particular problem. I wonder if that's obvious in a system design interview or not, or
No, I
if anyone
actually,
cares.
yeah, I was going to say, actually, I don't think there's much of a reason to care, because if you know the situations where, like if I told you, you could use a list or you could use a hash map, and you know the trivia of when you should use either one of them, like provided you know it, and then in a coding interview, kind of use it, like that's totally fine. So again, in a system design interview, if you know when you need a message queue and when you need, like take any load balance or any other sort of component, provided you know when to use it and you can demonstrate that you know when to use it, that's the ball game.
Cool. So I think, I think what's important here is actually understanding how to also frame those scenario. I guess you'll be given the scenario, like the system design interviews I've had. You're given a scenario, and you have to build a system that meets that scenario. And typically, the interviewer can also switch up the scenario during the interview to test out if you understand, how maybe a load balancer works or how the Redis cache may need to be used. So I think that can kind of come out within the interview. So I think understanding the components you'd use to build a system for the types of system you want to build are quite important.
Absolutely. And I do think that when it comes to the answers for these things, unlike leet code, where there is one optimal answer for doing this, what I'd say is there are potentially multiple right answers for most system design questions.
Yes.
And it's mostly a matter of like knowing what the trade-offs are and being explicit in them. So if you design Facebook Messenger, let's say, like you can choose to use different databases, and it doesn't really matter which one that you end up picking necessarily, depending on kind of like what use cases you're kind of like, are you supporting multimedia? Is it just text? Like some of these, it makes a difference as to what you pick. But there's not necessarily a right answer. What I will say is that doesn't mean there are no such thing as wrong answers. Like you definitely can have wrong answers. Like if you say that you're not going to use WebSockets, you're instead going to be long polling to see if messages are the same. Like that's a red flag, But there are such things as like varied answers within system design, which is very different. And I think that's a particularly hard transition point for the junior to intermediate engineers that are used to optimal answers on leet code, going into system design and being like, I don't know, like what's the right answer? But this is where ChatGPT, I think, can come in actually on the good side of things to be able to talk through like, hey, I'm building a messaging app. What are the trade-offs that are important in that? And that's actually something where AI shines, and you can get a lot of the interactions with bots and practicing those sorts of things. And it's a good way to practice those interviews if you can't afford to spend lots of money on senior engineers' time walking through interviews for that.
Yeah, good point. I think, again, it's if you're able to give a signal to the interviewer, and the way you do that in a system design interview is really understanding the pros and cons of why you've used a piece of technology. And I think there's nothing better that screams, I know what I'm talking about, than giving the pros and cons of why you've used a piece of technology, because that just shows that inherent understanding, I think. Because then you can easily swap it out with another component and go, no, actually, we scrap that. If the requirements have changed, then we need to do something different. And the only way you could really emphasize that you understand the interview and the problem is by giving the pros and cons, I think.
You're so right. And even with the analogy that you had earlier, where it's like, I'm going to use a hash map because of O1 amortized time. Like that's a great example of like the trade-offs. Like you could have used a list. You could have just done linear scans to pick up things. And it's the same thing. I think people view system design as a totally different ballgame. And I've always seen them as a like they are very distinct, but they're still the same thing. Like we talk about time complexity and we talk about space complexity, and the equivalents in system design that a lot of people I think don't make the connection on are we're talking about like, okay, what's the CPU? Like how much like sort of bandwidth can we get through this sort of thing? And then how much are we storing? Like that's time and space the same way. We're just talking the same trade-offs, just at a larger scale.
Yeah, that's a good point. Really good point. Yeah.
Sweet.
Awesome. Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've appreciated you coming on Tech and Test and giving your insights into helping folks really improve their interview skill. There's a lot to learn here, a lot to digest. And I think if I'm going to replay this episode back, there's a lot of notes to be taken, right, from the stuff we've discussed. Just want to share the book again. This is the book, Beyond Cracking the Coding Interview. So if you've got the original one, this is like a much more pumped up version with more of the stuff we've talked about around. There's more chapters on behavior interviews. There's some patterns in there, like, the 2 pointers, sliding windows, all that kind of cool stuff that people need to know. And a little bit about AI as well, with how interviews are being, changed with tech interviews. So I highly recommend folks go and get a copy because I think it's really helpful. And as we've discussed, having a book you can work through and like a way of getting to the end goal instead of just bashing out loads of problems. Here, there's a path on topics that are typically come up in coding interviews, which I think is very useful. So, so definitely check out that book. And Michael, thank you for coming on. Thank you, really appreciate your time.
So much. Yeah, thanks so much, Peter. I appreciate you inviting me on. And just for your listeners, if they're interested at all, we dropped in the show notes free chapters for the book. There's the first, I think, 9 chapters we're giving away for free. You're more than welcome to check them out. There's 150 new problems as well that you can also try for free if you have an account on Interviewing.io. So you can just go right to the book tab, and then all of the problems are actually available for you to try immediately in an AI interviewer. It's a pretty cool experience because you get to kind of practice the actual skill of interviewing rather than just the skill of just like memorize, like doing questions over and over again. And the last thing I'd say is that the actual cracking the coding interview book, we get this question all the time, which is why I wanted to say it. You don't need the original cracking the coding interview book for the sequel. The sequel covers everything in a more expanded and sort of, we sort of expanded everything in it from there. So if you're interested in the book, we appreciate that. But thanks so much for letting me on the podcast, Peter. I appreciate this, and I hope folks got some value out of it.